The nurse's voice dropped so low I almost didn't hear her over the beeping of the machines. Honey, I need you to stay very still and not react to what I'm about to tell you. I was lying in a hospital bed in Savannah, Georgia, hooked up to an IV after a minor car accident. Nothing serious, a cracked rib, some bruising. I'd been awake for maybe 20 minutes. My guardian, the man I'd called uncle my whole life, was supposedly on his way. The nurse leaned closer. There's a federal agent outside this room. He's been waiting since they brought you in. The reason, she glanced at the door, is your social security number. I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. It belongs to a little girl who died in Phoenix in 1993. She was 4 years old. I was 31. Let me back up, because none of this will make sense without the beginning. And the beginning, as far as I knew it, started in a house in Macon, Georgia, with a man named Elliot. Elliot was my guardian, not my father. He made that distinction clear from the time I was old enough to understand words. He was my mother's older brother, he told me, and when my parents died in a fire when I was 2, he'd taken me in out of obligation. That was the word he used, obligation. Not love, not family loyalty, obligation, like I was a utility bill he hadn't chosen but couldn't cancel. My name, he told me, was June Carroll. I had no reason to doubt it. Growing up in that house was like living inside a held breath. Elliot was a partner at a mid-sized accounting firm in Macon, the kind of man who wore pressed khakis on Saturdays and kept his lawn immaculate because what the neighbors thought mattered more than what happened behind closed doors. He wasn't violent. I want to be clear about that. He never raised a hand to me. But there are ways to make a child feel invisible that leave no marks, and Elliot had mastered all of them. I ate dinner at the kitchen counter while he ate in the dining room. I wore clothes from Goodwill while he drove a Lexus. When I won a countywide essay contest in 8th grade, he said, "Don't let it go to your head. Plenty of smart people amount to nothing." When I got into the University of Georgia on a partial scholarship, he said I should consider community college instead. That ambition in someone with my background usually led to disappointment. I asked him once, I was maybe 15, what he meant by my background. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "You don't come from money, June. You come from loss. There's a difference, and you'd do well to remember it." I went to UGA anyway. I took out loans, worked 2 jobs, finished in 4 years with a degree in healthcare administration. I built a life in Savannah, a small apartment near Forsyth Park, a job at a regional hospital, a routine that was mine and no one else's. I called Elliot on holidays because that's what you do. The calls lasted 11 minutes on average. I counted once. Then, 3 weeks before my hospital stay, something happened that I didn't know would change everything. I'd been having some abnormal blood work results. Nothing alarming, but my primary care doctor wanted to rule out a hereditary clotting disorder. She asked for family medical history. I told her what I knew, which was almost nothing. She suggested a comprehensive genetic panel. I sent in the kit. I didn't think much of it. The results came back flagging a marker that didn't match anything in the Carroll family medical records Elliot had provided when I was in his custody. The genetic counselor said it wasn't necessarily significant, these things happened, but that I might want to look into my biological family history more thoroughly if I could. I called Elliot. I asked him calmly if there was anything about my parents' medical history he hadn't told me. There was a pause on the line. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then he said, "Your parents are dead, June. There's nothing to tell." And he hung up. 2 weeks later, I was in a car accident on I-16. The other driver ran a red A, and I ended up in the hospital with a cracked rib. Routine intake. Routine ID check. Except my social security number pulled up a flag in a federal database that had been active for 27 years. The federal agent's name was Special Agent Mercer. He was tall, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of calm that comes from having delivered impossible news many times before. He sat in the chair beside my hospital bed with a manila folder on his lap and asked me to tell him everything I knew about my life before age 5. I told him what Elliot had told me, house fire. Both parents gone. Elliot stepped in. Agent Mercer opened the folder. He placed a photograph on my tray table. It was a missing child poster. The girl in the photo had my nose. My exact nose, the slightly upturned one I'd always been self-conscious about. She had dark eyes like mine and a small scar near her left eyebrow from what the poster said was a bicycle fall. I touched my left eyebrow. My scar has been there so long I'd stopped noticing it. The child's name was Anna Voss. She had gone missing from Scottsdale, Arizona in the summer of 1995. She was 2 years old. Her parents, a couple named Warren and Diane Voss, had been searching for her for 29 years. Agent Mercer said, "We believe you are Anna Voss." I said, "That's not possible." He said, "We'd like to do a DNA confirmation, with your consent, but the preliminary evidence is significant. The SSN you've been using was issued to a girl named June Carroll who died of a fever in 1993 before she was old enough to have any records attached to it. Someone used that identity to build a new life for a child they wanted to disappear." I stared at the poster. The little girl stared back. "Who?" I said. "Who would do that?" Agent Mercer looked at me very carefully before he answered. "We've been looking at your guardian, Elliot Marsh, for some time." The DNA results took 72 hours. 72 hours during which I lay in that hospital bed and tried to rebuild every memory I had, looking for cracks I'd never noticed. There were more than I expected. I remembered asking Elliot, when I was 8 or 9, why we didn't have any photos from before I was 5. He said the fire took everything. I accepted that. Children accept what adults tell them, because what else can they do? I remembered that we never visited any of my mother's side of the family, because Elliot said there was no one left. I accepted that too. I remembered that every time I asked about my parents, what they looked like, how they met, what their names were, Elliot would go quiet and then say something like, "It's painful, June. Please don't ask me to go through it." And I would feel guilty for asking. I would apologize. I was very well trained to feel guilty for existing in spaces where I wasn't entirely welcome. The results came back on a Thursday morning. I was a 99.98% match for Anna Voss. Agent Mercer was there when they told me. So was a victim's advocate named Ms. Patterson, who sat beside me and held my hand and didn't say anything useless like, "It'll be okay." She just held my hand. Warren and Diane Voss had been contacted. They were flying in from Scottsdale. I didn't know how to feel about that. I'd had 31 years to not know I was missing them. They'd had 31 years of knowing I was gone. We were strangers who were also, somehow, everything to each other. But first, there was Elliot. I'd been discharged from the hospital and was staying in a bureau-arranged hotel room when Agent Mercer told me what they'd found. Elliot Marsh had been my father's business partner, not my mother's brother. There was no connection to my mother at all. He and my biological father, Warren Voss, had co-owned a commercial real estate investment firm in the late 1980s and early 1990s. When the market tanked, my father had the liquidity to survive it. Elliot didn't. He'd been quietly bleeding the company's accounts for 2 years when my father found out and moved to dissolve the partnership and pursue fraud charges. In 1995, 3 weeks before the dissolution was finalized, I went missing from our backyard in Scottsdale. I was 2 years old. The civil case fell apart without my father's capacity to pursue it. Grief, the agent explained, does that to people. Elliot walked away. He relocated to Georgia. He took me with him under a dead child's name, and for 29 years he had been collecting the interest on a $2.3 million trust fund that my maternal grandparents had established in my name before they passed. $2.3 million. I sat with that number for a long time. All those years of Goodwill clothes and kitchen counters and, "You don't come from money, June." All those carefully constructed reminders that I was a burden, that I owed him something for the obligation he'd shouldered, that my ambitions were laughable. He had been living off my inheritance the entire time. He hadn't just stolen my identity, he'd stolen my family, my name, my history, and my money, and then he'd made me feel small for wanting more than he allowed me to have. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that. It doesn't announce itself. It wears the face of reluctant generosity. Elliot arrived at the FBI field office in Savannah on a Friday afternoon, presumably because Agent Mercer had called him in for what was framed as a routine follow-up regarding my hospital records. I was in an adjacent room. I could see him through the glass. He was wearing his pressed khakis and a navy blazer. He looked exactly like what he was, a respectable man in late middle age, the kind of person who gets invited to sit on nonprofit boards and whose opinion is solicited at neighborhood association meetings. He looked completely unworried. That lasted until Agent Mercer placed the DNA results on the table in front of him. I watched his face. I had spent 31 years reading that face, learning its moods the way you learn to read weather patterns when you know a storm can come without much warning. I knew every version of Elliot's expression. I had never seen this one before. It started as confusion, practiced confusion, the kind he used when he wanted to seem above accusation. Then something shifted underneath it, a recalculation. His eyes went to the folder, to Mercer, to the two-way glass. He couldn't see me, but I could see him understand, in real time, that the architecture he had built over 3 decades had a structural problem he had never planned for. A hospital intake form, a routine ID check, 29 years of careful construction, and it ended because I cracked a rib on I-16. His lawyer arrived within 40 minutes. They conferred in hushed voices. The lawyer, to his credit, was good. He immediately moved toward the statute of limitations, arguing that any financial claims were time-barred, that criminal charges related to events in 1995 were unprovable 30 years later. That's when the second agent in the room, a woman named Agent Yoon who had said almost nothing up to that point, opened her own folder. She explained in the pleasant, measured tone of someone delivering genuinely excellent news that under federal law there is no statute of limitations on the kidnapping of a minor. None. The clock on that charge does not start running until the victim is identified and freed. I had been identified 4 days ago. The clock had not started yet. And then she explained the constructive trust doctrine. Because Elliot had used funds held in trust for me, funds he had accessed through fraudulent guardianship documents and identity fabrication, he had never legally owned any of it. A constructive trust is what courts impose when someone acquires assets through fraud or breach of fiduciary duty. The legal system doesn't care that he'd had possession of the money for nearly 3 decades. Possession acquired through wrongdoing doesn't become ownership with time. Every dollar of interest, every investment return, every asset purchased with those funds was traceable and recoverable. His lawyer went very quiet. Elliot looked at the glass again. I pressed my hand flat against it, even though I knew he couldn't see me. I needed to feel something solid. He said quietly, to no one in particular, she was never supposed to find out. Agent Mercer said, "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to need you to stand up. I want to tell you about the moment I met my parents, my real parents." Warren and Diane Voss flew in from Scottsdale on a Saturday morning. The Bureau arranged for us to meet in a private room at the field office. No cameras, no pressure, Ms. Patterson nearby in case anyone needed a moment. I don't know what I expected. I think I expected it to feel cinematic somehow, like something would click into place the way it does in movies. A look, a word, some biological recognition that would cut through 3 decades of absence. It wasn't like that. It was messier and quieter and more real than anything I could have anticipated. My mother walked in first. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me, and I watched her face do what faces do when they see something they have wanted for so long that wanting it has become its own kind of grief. She didn't rush toward me. She just stood there for a moment, pressing her fingers against her mouth, and then she said, very softly, "You have my mother's nose." That was when I started crying. I don't entirely know why that particular sentence did it, but it did. My father hung back. He's a quiet man. I've come to understand. He processes things internally before he expresses them, which is apparently something I do too, which my therapist says is meaningful. He shook my hand first, formally, which sounds strange but was somehow exactly right. Then he pulled me into a hug that lasted a long time and said nothing at all. We sat together for 3 hours that first day. They brought photos. 31 years worth of photos of a child they'd never stopped looking for. age-progressed images, birthday cakes with a candle lit for the absent daughter, a bedroom in their Scottsdale house that my mother told me, quietly, they had never converted to anything else. They had 2 other children, a son named Miles, who was born after I disappeared, and an older daughter named Fern, who had been 5 when I went missing and remembered me as the baby sister who was there one day and gone the next. They were waiting back in Scottsdale. They'd wanted to come. My parents had asked them to wait, to give me time. That kind of thoughtfulness, the instinct to give me room, to not overwhelm, told me more about who these people were than anything else could have. I flew to Scottsdale 6 weeks later. That's a different story and a longer one, and someday maybe I'll tell it in full. What I'll say now is that walking into that house, seeing the room my mother had kept, touching the photos on the walls, sitting at a dinner table with a family that was somehow mine, felt like something I don't have adequate words for. Not like coming home exactly. More like discovering that home had existed all along, in a place I didn't know to look. Elliot was charged with kidnapping, identity fraud, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. His assets were frozen within 48 hours of his arrest. The accounting firm he built, the respectable career, the Lexus, the immaculate lawn, was built on a foundation that didn't belong to him, and the moment that became legally clear, it began to collapse. His attorney tried several approaches. The statute of limitations argument was dead. They moved to suppress certain financial records, which the court denied. They argued diminished capacity, which, given the meticulous 30-year paper trail Elliot had maintained, did not land well with the judge. The trust fund assets, the original $2.3 million plus 3 decades of compounded returns, were the subject of a civil recovery action that my attorney, a woman named Ms. Hale, who I would recommend to anyone facing anything, described as one of the more straightforward constructive trust cases she'd handled, given the documentation. I don't say any of this to sound cold. I spent a lot of time not feeling cold about it. I spent a lot of time sitting in my Savannah apartment, looking at walls I'd decorated with things I'd bought with money I'd earned at my hospital job, thinking about every small humiliation I'd absorbed over 31 years, and understanding that they hadn't been character building. They'd been a management strategy. He'd needed me small. He'd needed me grateful for whatever he allowed me to have, unlikely to ask questions, unlikely to dig. Every time he implied I wasn't smart enough or ambitious enough or worthy enough, he was protecting his investment. The thing that stayed with me, that I couldn't put down for a long time, was a specific memory. I was 16, and I'd found a college savings brochure in the mail addressed to someone named Anna Voss at our Macon address. I'd shown it to Elliot, assuming it was junk mail, some kind of error. He'd taken it from my hand without looking at it, said, "Wrong address, happens all the time," and thrown it away. He'd been monitoring the mail for 29 years for exactly that kind of slip. And I had handed it to him and apologized for bothering him with it. That one cost me still. At his sentencing, I chose to give a victim impact statement. I'd written it and rewritten it many times. The final version was shorter than I expected. I said that the most lasting damage wasn't the money or even the years. It was the specific way he'd made me feel about myself. That the cruelty hadn't been loud or obvious. It had been architectural. It had shaped the space I believed I was allowed to occupy. And undoing that, learning to take up room without apologizing for it, was the work I was still doing and would probably be doing for years. I said that I didn't need him to understand what he cost me. I just needed the court to understand it clearly. He sat at the defense table in a suit that was slightly too large for him. He'd lost weight since the arrest, and he didn't look at me once. I had spent 31 years trying not to bother him. On that day, I made myself look directly at the side of his face until I was done speaking. He received 22 years. He is 64 years old. I still live in Savannah. I kept my apartment near Forsyth Park, partly because I love it and partly because it was the first space that was entirely mine, chosen without anyone else's voice in my head telling me it was too much. I video call Miles and Fern every Sunday now. My mother sends me recipes. She's an extraordinary cook, which apparently skips a generation, because I am not, but I'm trying. My father and I talk about real estate sometimes, which has a strange resonance given everything, and he says I have a good instinct for it, which given the history is both funny and not funny at all. I'm in therapy. I have been since 2 months after everything came out. My therapist is patient and asks good questions and doesn't flinch when I say that I still sometimes catch myself making myself smaller in rooms and that I'm working on it, and that working on it is enough for now. The room in Scottsdale is still there. My mother asked if I wanted her to change it, make it a guest room, something neutral. I told her to leave it for now, not because I live in it, I don't, but because there's something I need about knowing it exists, a space that was held open, a proof that I was looked for. I was looked for 29 years, in a world where most missing children cases go cold. My parents kept looking. They never filed paperwork to have me declared dead. They never closed the case in any sense of the word. That matters to me in a way I'm still learning how to carry. I am 31 years old. My name is Anna, and I have had it back for 8 months. And some days that still feels new enough that I have to remind myself it's real. That the life I'm building now, with a family I didn't know existed and a name that belongs to me and a history that is finally my own, is not something that can be taken away again. Elliot built his whole strategy on the assumption that I would never know to look. He forgot that all it takes is one crack in the surface, one rib on I-16, one nurse leaning close and saying, "Honey, don't react." I didn't run from what she told me. I stayed. I found out who I really was. And it turned out I was someone worth finding. I keep coming back to that college savings brochure, the one addressed to Anna Voss that arrived at Elliot's house when I was 16. I handed it to him. I said sorry for bothering him with it, and he threw it away while I watched, and I thought nothing of it because he had spent 14 years making sure I would think nothing of it. That's the part that stays with me longest, not the money, not even the name. It's how completely I had been shaped to look away from the very things that could have freed me. He didn't need locks or threats, he just needed me to believe I wasn't worth much. And I did. For a long time, I really did. What undid him wasn't anything dramatic. It was a cracked rib, a routine intake form, a nurse who decided I deserved to know the truth even when knowing it would be hard. Elliot spent 31 years building something airtight, and it came apart because of an accident on I-16 and one person who chose to be honest when she didn't have to be. That matters to me. The choice she made in that moment, to tell me carefully, to give me the chance to stay steady, was a small act and an enormous one at the same time. Integrity like that is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds when everything else is shaking. What Elliot had was intelligence without any of that. He was genuinely smart. The paper trail he maintained for 3 decades, the meticulous way he managed the trust accounts, the careful construction of a life that looked completely legitimate from the outside. All of that required real skill. And he used every bit of it to take from a 2-year-old child and then spend 30 years making that child feel like she should be grateful for whatever scraps he allowed her. That's what happens when sharp thinking operates without any anchor to what's actually right. It doesn't stay neutral. It gets applied to whatever serves the person using it, and eventually it destroys something or someone that didn't deserve to be destroyed. I think about my parents, Warren and Diane, during those 29 years. The case that never went cold. The bedroom they never converted. The birthday candles. I think about what it takes to keep looking for someone when the world is mostly moved on, when there's no new evidence, when hope is genuinely hard to justify. That kind of persistence isn't stubbornness. It's a decision made over and over again to keep going even when stopping would be easier and maybe even reasonable. I didn't know to look for them, but they never stopped looking for me. And because they didn't, I was findable when the moment finally came. I'm still learning what to do with all of it. The name, the family, the history that was always mine and that I'm only now getting to know. Some days, it feels like I'm catching up to a life that was running ahead of me for 3 decades. But I'm not behind. I know that now. I was just being held in place by someone who needed me to stay still. I'm not still anymore.